In 1822, a wagon train arrived at a new settlement in Missouri. The travelers had spent 3 months crossing the prairie. They had survived storms, sickness, and near starvation. But when they reached their destination, a cluster of maybe a dozen rough cabins along a muddy creek, the first question wasn't about food or shelter or even water. The first question was, do you have a blacksmith? The answer was no. Within a week, 3 families turned around and headed back east. This is the story of the frontier blacksmith, not the romanticized village smithy from Longfellow's poem, standing beneath a spreading chestnut tree. This is the real story, the soot-covered man working alone in a dim, hot shop who quite literally held civilization together with hammer and anvil. Between 1820 and 1860, the first half of the 19th century, American blacksmithing experienced what historians call its golden age. By 1860, the United States Census recorded 7,504 blacksmith workshops employing 15,720 workers. It was the 4th most popular trade in America after lumber milling, flour milling, and shoemaking. Those numbers don't tell the full story, because in every frontier settlement, mining camp, and cattle town from Texas to Montana, the blacksmith wasn't just another tradesman. He was the man who made everything else possible. When pioneers pushed westward into the vast emptiness beyond the Mississippi, they carried with them the tools of civilization: axes, plows, wagon hardware, cooking pots, knives. Every single one of those items was either made by a blacksmith or would soon need to be repaired by one. And here's the brutal reality of frontier life. Those tools broke constantly. Plow blades hit rocks and snapped, wagon axles cracked under the strain of prairie trails, horseshoes wore through in weeks. Even simple things like door hinges, kettle handles, and knife blades could fail at the worst possible moment. Without a blacksmith, a settlement couldn't survive. It was that simple. A farmer with a broken plow blade couldn't plant crops. A freighter with a cracked wagon axle couldn't haul supplies. A rancher couldn't fence his land or brand his cattle or shoe his horses. The blacksmith was the only person who could fix what was broken and forge what was needed. That's why, in most frontier towns, the blacksmith shop was often the first permanent structure built, even before churches or schools, sometimes even before a proper general store. The economics made perfect sense. A blacksmith could earn between $1 and $2 per day when work was available. Good money for the time. For basic repair work like mending plows or rakes, smiths typically earned $1 to $1.50 per day. But for creating new items from scratch, they could charge up to $5.50 per day. Compare that to a cowboy making $25 to $40 per month. A blacksmith working steadily could match a cowboy's monthly wages in just 3 weeks. The profit margins were substantial, but the startup costs were remarkably low. All a smith needed was a forge, an anvil, a bellows, and a basic set of tools. The forge was where the magic happened. It was essentially a hearth fueled by charcoal or coal, with bellows attached to force oxygen into the fire and drive temperatures up to 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit or higher. At those temperatures, iron turned cherry red and became soft enough to bend and shape. The anvil was the smith's workbench. The standard design, called the London pattern, became common in the 1800s. It featured a flat face for hammering, a curved horn for bending metal into curves, a step for cutting, and holes for securing specialized tools. Every part had a purpose refined over centuries of metalworking. The bellows were crucial. Hand-pumped or, later, mechanically powered, they forced air into the coals to concentrate and intensify the heat. Without proper airflow, the forge couldn't reach the temperatures needed to work iron. Beyond those essentials, a smith accumulated hundreds of specialized tools over his career. Hammers of different weights, tongs for holding hot metal, chisels for cutting, forms and swages for shaping specific items. Many of these tools were made by the blacksmith himself, for himself, which meant each smith's toolkit was as unique as his workshop. And the workshop itself? Most frontier blacksmith shops were small, one-room buildings made of logs, lumber, brick, or stone, depending on what materials were available locally and what the climate demanded. Here's a detail that surprises most people. Blacksmith shops were intentionally kept dark inside. They had 1 or 2 windows at most, and smiths preferred minimal lighting. Why? Because in the darkness, they could see the glow of heated metal more clearly. The color of that glow told them everything they needed to know about the metal's temperature and readiness for working. Cherry red meant ready to shape. White hot meant ready to weld. Orange meant cooling down, time to return it to the forge. In bright light, those subtle color differences disappeared. So smiths worked in the perpetual twilight of their shops, reading the language of glowing iron the way sailors read the sea. The floor was usually dirt, though some smiths preferred wooden floors for the warmth they provided in winter. The dirt floor had its advantages, though. It was fireproof, and dropped tools wouldn't shatter on impact. Scrap metal piled in corners. Extra charcoal waited near the forge. The smell of coal smoke, hot iron, and sweat permeated everything. And the noise. The constant rhythmic ringing of hammer on anvil became the heartbeat of any settlement. On the frontier, that sound meant civilization. It meant someone was working. It meant the tools that kept everyone alive were being made and mended. But what exactly were blacksmiths making? Hollywood would have you believe frontier blacksmiths spent most of their time shoeing horses. The reality was very different. Horseshoeing, technically the work of a farrier, though many frontier blacksmiths did farrier work too, only occupied about 25% of a smith's time at most. The specialists who only shod horses were rare on the frontier. 50 to 60% of a blacksmith's work consisted of repairing farm implements, plows, rakes, hoes, shovels, axes, all the tools farmers relied on to break the prairie and plant crops. These implements took brutal punishment from rocky soil, roots, and constant use. The rest of their time went to creating new items: nails, door hinges, wagon hardware, barrel hoops, kettle handles, fireplace cranes, branding irons, gate latches, chains, horseshoes, knives, even surgical instruments and tools for other tradesmen. The frontier blacksmith had to be what they called a jack of all trades. Unlike medieval smiths who could specialize in specific products, frontier smiths had to be able to make or fix anything made of metal. Specialization was a luxury the frontier couldn't afford. Let's talk about nails for a moment, because they tell you everything you need to know about how valuable a blacksmith's work actually was. Before 1830, a skilled blacksmith could forge 1 nail per minute. That's it, 1 nail. 60 nails per hour if he worked without stopping. Think about what that means. A modern house uses approximately 40,000 nails. At 1 nail per minute, working 10 hours a day, it would take a blacksmith nearly 2 months of doing nothing but making nails to supply a single house. Nails were so valuable that people would sometimes burn down abandoned buildings just to collect the nails from the ashes. The nails were worth more than the lumber. After 1830, machine-cut nails began appearing, sheets of metal that builders could break off pieces from. But on the frontier, far from railroads and supply lines, those machine-made nails were expensive and hard to obtain. Blacksmiths kept making them by hand because there was no alternative. The arrival of machine-made goods in the latter half of the 1800s represented both a threat and an opportunity for blacksmiths. Mass production could make items cheaper and faster than any smith working by hand. But those mass-produced items still broke, and they still needed repair. Smart blacksmiths adapted. They shifted more of their work toward horseshoeing and wagon repair as people moved from farms into cities and needed transportation. They took on larger, more complex projects that machines couldn't yet replicate. They evolved to stay valuable. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's talk about how someone became a blacksmith in the first place. There were no trade schools on the frontier. There were no certificates or licenses. The only path to becoming a blacksmith was through apprenticeship. A boy, almost always a boy, Though women worked in blacksmith shops as nail makers and occasionally as smiths themselves, would be bound as an apprentice to a master blacksmith for a term typically lasting 7 years. 7 years. From around age 14 to 21, that boy would live and work in the master's shop, learning the craft through endless repetition and observation. The terms of apprenticeship were formal and legally binding. The master agreed to house, feed, clothe, and instruct the apprentice. The apprentice agreed to work for the master, obey him, and learn the trade. Some apprenticeships included a fee paid by the apprentice's family. Others were based purely on the exchange of labor for training. The work started simple: cleaning tools, organizing the shop, pumping the bellows, holding pieces while the master worked, watching, always watching. Slowly, the apprentice would be allowed to try simple tasks: heating metal in the forge, basic hammer work under supervision, making simple items like hooks or nails. The learning curve was brutal. Burns were inevitable. A moment's inattention near the forge could mean a nasty scar. Hammering hot metal required perfect timing and technique. Miss your mark and you might hit your own hand. Grip the hammer wrong and you'd develop blisters that made work agonizing. But gradually, through years of repetition, the movements became automatic. The apprentice learned to read the color of heated metal. He learned which hammer to use for which task. He learned how to control the fire, when to fold the metal, how to weld 2 pieces into one. By around 1830, it became more common for masters to pay apprentices a small wage instead of housing them. This shift reflected changing economic realities. Masters needed the labor, but housing a growing boy for 7 years was expensive. At age 21, the apprentice became a journeyman, competent in the craft and capable of performing most tasks, but not yet experienced enough to be called a master. Many journeymen worked for established smiths, earning regular wages while building their skills and reputation. Eventually, with enough experience and saved capital, a journeyman might open his own shop. That's when the real challenge began. Because a blacksmith wasn't just a craftsman, he was a businessman. Blacksmiths had to be skilled negotiators. They worked for themselves, which meant setting their own prices, managing their own inventory, keeping detailed account books, and collecting debts. Cash was scarce on the frontier. Most transactions happened through a complex web of credit, barter, and traded services. A blacksmith might shoe a farmer's horse in exchange for a bushel of corn. He might make hinges for the general store owner in return for credit toward supplies. He might forge tools for the carpenter who would then build an addition onto the blacksmith's house. The account books blacksmiths kept were meticulous, every transaction recorded, every debt noted. At the end of the year, accounts would be settled, sometimes with cash, often with goods, occasionally with more promises. This system required social skills as much as metalworking ability. A blacksmith had to build relationships with other tradesmen and businessmen in the community. He had to know who was reliable and who wasn't. He had to balance firmness about payment with enough flexibility that people kept bringing him work, and he had to manage his materials carefully. Wrought iron, the primary metal blacksmiths worked with until the 1830s, cost about 6 cents per pound. Steel cost between 18 and 25 cents per pound. Transportation fees from the general store to the workshop added to the cost. Smart blacksmiths saved every scrap of metal, recycling it into new projects. Nothing went to waste when your raw materials were expensive and hard to obtain. The workshop itself became a center of community life, especially in isolated frontier settlements. The shop was open during summer and comfortably warm in winter. The forge saw to that. It became a natural gathering place, particularly for men, farmers waiting for repairs, travelers needing work done before moving on. Young men with nothing better to do than watch the smith work and swap stories. The blacksmith heard everything: town gossip, political debates, news from travelers, business dealings. He was often called the rural philosopher of the community, not necessarily because he was wise, but because his shop was where information flowed. In settlements too small or too new to have newspapers, The blacksmith shop functioned as an informal newsroom. If you wanted to know what was happening in the territory or the nation, you stopped by the smithy. The social role extended beyond gossip. In some settlements, town meetings were held in blacksmith shops before proper town halls existed. Business deals were struck there. Political campaigns were planned there. The rhythmic clang of hammer on anvil provided the soundtrack to countless important conversations. And the blacksmith himself? He commanded respect, not always social respect. He was, after all, covered in soot and sweat most of the time, working in a profession that left him perpetually dirty. But practical respect? Absolutely. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow captured this in his 1839 poem, The Village Blacksmith, describing the smith as having large and sinewy hands, and noting that the muscles of his brawny arms are strong as iron bands. It was physical work, exhausting work, dangerous work. A blacksmith who didn't develop significant strength couldn't do the job. Hammering red-hot iron for 10 to 13 hours a day, 6 days a week, built muscles and calluses and a tolerance for heat that few other professions required. The typical blacksmith's day started early. Before dawn, he'd arrive at the shop and light the forge, a process that could take 30 minutes or more. Coal or charcoal had to be arranged properly, kindling added, the fire carefully tended until it reached working temperature. Then the work began. Heat metal, hammer it into shape, return it to the forge, heat it again, hammer again. The cycle repeated hundreds of times each day. Each hammer blow had to be precise. Too hard, and you'd damage the metal or your tools. Too soft, and you'd waste time and heat. Between projects, the smith maintained his equipment. Bellows needed repair. Tools needed sharpening. The forge needed cleaning of clinkers, chunks of impurities that built up in the coal and reduced efficiency. The anvil face needed periodic dressing to keep it smooth. And the physical toll? Burns were constant. Small ones mostly, a bit of hot metal touching your forearm, a spark landing on your neck. But severe burns happened too, usually from mistakes or equipment failures. Smiths rarely wore gloves because they needed to feel the metal, which meant their hands bore the marks of their trade. But the respect went deeper than physical strength. In a frontier community where survival depended on functional tools and equipment, the blacksmith held real power. Cross him and your broken plow might sit in his shop for weeks. Need something urgently and he could name his price. One chronicler noted that in frontier settlements, even though he was a lowly blacksmith, covered in soot and smoke and everything else, everybody needed him. He had a purpose in life right up until he dropped. That last phrase is important. A blacksmith's value didn't diminish with age. Unlike farmhands or manual laborers whose worth declined as their strength faded, an experienced blacksmith's knowledge and skill actually made him more valuable over time. The youngest apprentice might have strong arms, but he didn't know which hammer to use for which task. He didn't know how to read the metal. He didn't know the 100 small tricks that made the difference between a tool that worked and one that broke. That knowledge took years, sometimes decades, to accumulate. A master blacksmith in his 50s or 60s, even if his arms weren't as strong as they once were, could still command premium prices because he knew things younger smiths didn't. As America industrialized in the latter half of the 19th century, many frontier crafts disappeared. Machines could produce goods faster and cheaper than any craftsman working by hand, but blacksmithing adapted rather than died. Yes, machines could stamp out nails by the thousands, but they couldn't repair a specific wagon wheel or forge a custom tool or shoe a nervous horse. The automobile eventually replaced the horse, which eliminated much of the horseshoeing work. But by then, blacksmiths had already evolved. Some became farriers specializing exclusively in horseshoeing for remaining work animals and riding horses. Others became machinists and metalworkers, applying their skills to the new industrial economy. The knowledge didn't disappear. It transformed. Today, approximately 5,000 to 10,000 people in the United States still practice blacksmithing. Only about 10% do it professionally, But the craft survives through historical reenactors, artisans, and people keeping traditional skills alive. Museums across the West preserve blacksmith shops and demonstrate the craft to visitors who've never seen metal worked by hand. The rhythmic ring of hammer on anvil echoes across time, connecting us to the frontier settlers who built America one tool at a time. Because that's ultimately what blacksmiths did. They didn't explore new territories or fight wars or write laws. They made the tools that allowed everyone else to do those things. They turned iron into axes that felled trees for cabins, into plows that broke the prairie sod, into nails that held buildings together, into horseshoes that carried settlers westward, into knives that prepared food and weapons that provided protection. Every farm, every ranch, every mine, every town, all of it depended on the work done in that hot, dark shop where a soot-covered man stood at his anvil, reading the glow of metal and shaping it to human need. The frontier blacksmith's heyday lasted roughly from 1820 to 1890, 70 years when westward expansion created endless demand for their skills. But the true legacy isn't measured in years or economic impact. It's measured in the simple fact that without blacksmiths, none of it would have been possible. Not the homesteads, not the railroads, not the ranches or the mines or the towns that eventually became cities. The blacksmith wasn't romantic. He wasn't glamorous. He wasn't the hero of frontier stories. But he was absolutely essential. The man every frontier town needed first, the man who made everything else possible. The next time you see a handmade nail, a door hinge, or a horseshoe, remember? Someone stood in a hot, dark shop and forged that object with hammer and anvil and patient skill learned over years of burning themselves, making mistakes, and slowly mastering one of humanity's oldest crafts. That was the frontier blacksmith, covered in soot, arms like iron bands, making civilization possible, one hammer strike at a time.